Avery Mae Callahan scraped frost from the inside of her windshield with the edge of a library card that had expired in March. The plastic bent in her hand, shaving pale curls of ice onto the dashboard of her hatchback where a diner apron lay folded beside two unpaid bills and a paper cup gone soft at the rim. Outside the sign for Marlene's Harbor Diner hung dark over Route 1, its red letters still promising coffee, though the place had served its last pot 5 days earlier. She had slept behind the building because the wind from the bay hit less sharply there. The dumpster blocked one side. A stack of empty produce crates blocked the other. At 2 in the morning, a truck had pulled in and left again without seeing her, or at least without saying so. By dawn, her breath had silvered the glass, and the wool blanket around her knees smelled faintly of fryer oil from the room she used to rent above the kitchen. Avery wiped a circle clear and looked at the diner's back door. Marlene had cried when she handed over the last envelope of cash. Storm water had come through the roof, the insurance check had not stretched, and the owner of the building wanted a winter tenant with a cleaner balance sheet. Nobody had shouted. Nobody had lied. The work had simply ended, and with it the narrow bed under the sloped ceiling, the hot plate, and the shelf where Avery had kept her mother's blue mug. In the glove compartment under the registration she found 2 quarters and a folded receipt. She added them to the money in her canvas pouch. $214 counting coins. Enough for gas if she stayed south. Enough for a few nights in a cheap motel if she skipped meals. Not enough for a deposit. Not enough for repairs. Not enough to become the kind of person who could answer a landlord's questions without looking at the floor. Her phone buzzed against the passenger seat. The screen showed 1 bar and a voicemail from a number she did not know. She almost let it sit. Unknown numbers had become a weather system of their own, dead office's clinic reminders. Automated voices asking for money her mother had spent trying to stay alive. The voice was human older careful. Ms. Callahan, this is Paul Whitaker, attorney at law in Pine Harbor. I apologize for contacting you this way. I'm handling the estate of Margaret Bellamy, deceased, and your name appears in her will. Please call my office as soon as you're able. Avery played it twice, then a third time with the phone held close to her ear, as if the name might change if she listened more carefully. Margaret Bellamy meant nothing to her. Pine Harbor meant little more. She knew it as a small place, north of where the highway bent toward blueberry barrens and fishing roads, a town of gray shingles, lobster signs, and old brick buildings that looked as if salt had been rubbing them down for 100 years. Before we continue, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe. And tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. By 9, Avery had used a gas station sink to wash her face and had driven 43 miles with the heater off except on the hills. The attorney's office stood above a pharmacy with a green awning. Paul Whitaker met her at the stair landing before she could decide whether to knock. He was thin, white-haired, and wore a cardigan with leather patches on the elbows. In one hand he carried a file folder. In the other a mug of tea gone pale. "You drove yourself?" he asked. "I usually do." He nodded as if that answered something larger. His office smelled of paper dust and wintergreen lozenges. Avery sat on the front edge of a chair while he opened the folder and turned several pages toward her. "Margaret Bellamy died in September," he said. "No children. No surviving siblings. She left specific instructions regarding one property. Pine Harbor Engine House, formerly Station 2 on Bell Street." Avery stared at the legal description before the words found shape. A fire station. An old volunteer station, vacant for some time. "I don't know this woman." "I understand. No, I mean I've never heard her name in my life." Mr. Whitaker's eyes moved once toward the window, then back. "That may be true. The will is properly witnessed. There is also a letter for you, but her instructions say it is to be delivered at the property, not here." Avery pressed her thumb into the seam of her glove. The mended spot had split again, showing a crescent of skin. "Is this some kind of tax problem? There are back municipal fees, but no mortgage. The larger concern is the building itself. Pine Harbor has an open condemnation review. If the structure isn't secured and inspected before winter deepens, the town may move to take it down." So, I inherited a building they want to demolish. You inherited a building Margaret Bellamy did not want forgotten. That sentence sat between them too neat to trust. Avery had heard kind phrases used to cover broken appliances, unsafe rooms, unpaid hours. She asked the practical questions because they were safer. Was there a lien? Could she refuse? Could anyone else claim it? Did owning it mean she had to pay for its collapse if a wall fell onto the sidewalk? Mr. Whitaker answered each one without hurry. There was no purchase price. There was insurance trouble. There was risk. There was a key. There was, he admitted, very little money attached to the estate beyond enough to settle final bills. If Avery wanted to disclaim the inheritance, he could prepare papers. If she wanted to see it first, he could walk her there. She should have refused. A person with $214 had no business accepting brick slate and public danger. But when Mr. Whitaker set the key on the desk, she did not push it back. It was brass dark at the grooves with a paper tag tied in cotton string. Engine house, side door, Margaret had written in a slanted hand. The station stood 6 blocks from the harbor on a narrow street where summer cottages gave way to older working buildings. Avery saw the hose tower first. It rose from the rear corner of the firehouse like a square brick chimney with louvered openings near the top, taller than anything around it except the church steeple 2 streets over. Above the front roof line, a small cupola held a bell the color of old pennies. The building itself had 2 engine bay doors, both boarded from the inside with plywood gone gray at the edges. Ivy clung to the north wall. One gutter sagged loose and tapped the brick in the wind. The sign over the left bay had faded until only the ghost of gold letters remained, Pine Harbor Engine House. Avery stood across the street with Mr. Whitaker's file under her arm. Salt air moved through the empty block, carrying the smell of tide mud, cold stone, and diesel from the harbor. A gull cried once and vanished behind the roofline. It has no power, she asked. Disconnected 11 years ago, according to the town file. No heat, no active heat, no tenants, non-legal. That last word made her glance at him. I don't mean to imply anything he said. Only that vacant buildings sometimes attract people who need shelter. Avery looked at the boarded doors and thought of the produce crates behind the diner. Sometimes people need shelter because every legal room costs more than they have. Mr. Whitaker accepted that without correction. He gave her the file and pointed out a red notice stapled near the front entrance. The review date is November 19th. If you intend to keep it even briefly, you'll need to show the town you're securing it. Keeping it, Avery said. The words felt too large for her mouth. You don't have to decide today. But the key was already warming in her palm. He left her there with his business card and a promise to answer calls before 5. Avery circled his building slowly. The rear lean-to had partly caved in, scattering black roofing paper and wetboards into weeds. A cracked concrete apron sloped toward a rusted drain. At the base of the tower, behind a tangle of dead vines, a narrow side door wore a padlock newer than the hinges. She did not open it. Not yet. The station had the stillness of a room after an argument, and she had learned to listen before entering such places. She photographed the notice, the roofline, the broken louver, high in the tower, the boarded engine doors, the way mortar had powdered along one corner. Practical proof. If this was a trap, she wanted evidence of its teeth. By late afternoon, clouds thickened over Pine Harbor. Avery bought a cup of gas station soup and ate it in the car with the engine off. The town library let her charge her phone for 20 minutes. On an old public computer, she searched Margaret Bellamy and found 3 brief mentions: volunteer dispatcher, historical society donor, obituary with no photograph. She searched Pine Harbor Engine House and found a grainy image from decades earlier, the bay doors, open men in rubber coats standing beside a red truck. A woman at the edge of the frame with one hand on the alarm desk visible through the doorway. The caption did not name her. At dusk, Avery drove back to Bell Street. She told herself she was only checking whether the boards held. She told herself sleeping nearby was better than sleeping behind a closed diner where the new owner might call the police. She parked under a bare maple with the station filling her windshield. The cupola darkened first. Then the tower. Then the whole building became a solid shape against the dim harbor sky. No lights came on because no lights could. No furnace clicked. No refrigerator hummed. The old firehouse took the cold without complaint. Avery wrapped the blanket around her shoulders and leaned back. Her mother's blue mug sat in a box behind the driver's seat, cushioned in a diner towel. Elise Callahan had once told her that a place did not have to be pretty to be kind. Avery had been 14 then and angry about another rented room with bad pipes. She had not understood how low a standard kindness could become. Sometime before dawn, she woke with her hand gripping the steering wheel. A sound had passed through the car. Not thunder. Not a truck tailgate. A single iron note rolled over Bell Street and trembled in the glass deep enough to feel in her ribs. Avery sat up, heart beating, hard breath white in the dark. The fire station stood black and silent, struck. Avery pushed open the car door and stepped into the empty street. Cold bit through her socks because she had not taken time to pull on her boots properly. The power line to the building hung slack and dead against the wall. The meter box was blank. The front doors were boarded. High in the tower, the broken louver moved once in the wind. No rope hung from the cupola. No light showed inside. No one came out. She stood there until the vibration faded from the abandoned tower, holding Margaret Bellamy's brass key so tightly it left its shape in her palm. Avery waited until the sky turned the color of wet tin before she crossed to the side door. Her boots were on, now laced badly with cold fingers, and the brass key sat between her thumb and forefinger like something too old to trust. The padlock accepted it with a dry scrape. For a moment, nothing moved. Then the shackle gave way and the door shifted inward half an inch before swollen wood caught against the threshold. She set her shoulder to it. The door opened with a sound like a drawer pulled from a damp cabinet. Air breathed out of the station, stale and mineral, carrying old smoke, wet brick mouse droppings, and the faint iron smell of standing water. Avery stood still until her eyes adjusted. The side entry led into a narrow passage with beadboard walls blistered by moisture. A row of coat hooks held nothing but one cracked leather strap and a curl of rope fiber gone gray with dust. She took 3 steps in and stopped because the floor changed under her boot. The boards, near the wall, dipped slightly. Not enough to break enough to warn. She backed up, opened the flashlight on her phone, and angled the beam low. The old habit of surviving bad rooms came back without being called test before trusting. Keep one hand free, know where the door is. The passage opened into the engine bay. Even empty, it had the shape of readiness. 2 wide doors faced Bell Street, their arched tops hidden behind interior plywood. The concrete floor sloped toward cast-iron drains dark with grit. Along one wall, oak racks waited for hoses that had been gone for decades. A red line still ran across the plaster where equipment lockers had once stood. Above, timber trusses crossed the ceiling, stained black in places by old coal smoke and newer roof leaks. Avery lifted the flashlight and found the bell rope, or what had been the bell rope. A severed end hung high above the bay, stiff and frayed, disappearing through a round hole in the ceiling toward the cupola. The lower length was gone. Whoever had cut it had done so long ago. The fibers were the same color as the dust. She did not touch it. The watchroom stood behind an interior window clouded with grime. Inside, a wooden desk faced the bay, its surface scarred by rings, pencil marks, and one deep burn near the corner. A black alarm board hung on the wall, porcelain labels lined beneath tiny dead bulbs, North Wharf, Mill Road, Schoolhouse Lane, Bell Street. Below it sat a chair with one cracked spindle and a metal wastebasket full of plaster flakes. Avery placed her palm on the desk. It was colder than the air. Under the cold, she could feel shallow grooves where someone had written hard on paper again and again for years. In the office beyond, water had come through the ceiling and opened a brown stain above a filing cabinet. The top drawer was empty except for a paperclip and 2 dead moths. The second drawer stuck. She left it alone. The town notice had already told her enough: unsafe roof, unsecured openings, loose masonry, public hazard. The building did not need her curiosity making things worse. She photographed everything anyway. The sagging gutter through the broken transom, the warped boards near the side hall, the drain line clogged with leaves blown under the bay doors. The tower stairs, steep and narrow, blocked by a chain and a hand-painted warning, "Do not climb without second person." That sign stopped her more effectively than a lock. At the base of the hose tower, the air changed. It was colder there, moving downward in thin threads through the louvers high above. The tower rose like a vertical throat square and dim with old brackets fixed to the walls where canvas hoses would once have hung to dry. Avery shone her light upward. Dust drifted through the beam. Somewhere above, metal clicked once, not loud enough to be the bell, not soft enough to ignore. She stepped back into the engine bay. A truck rolled slowly past outside and stopped. Avery froze, half expecting a police cruiser, but the engine was rougher and older. A door opened. Boots crossed the sidewalk. 3 firm knocks sounded against the boarded bay door. "You inside?" a man called. Avery did not answer at once. "I'm not here to run you out," he said. "Name's Jonah Reed. Paul Whitaker said you might come by." Door on the side stick. She kept the watchroom desk between herself and the passage. "It opens. Then I'll stand out here until you decide whether I'm useful." That was the sort of sentence a person used when he understood locked doors. Avery went to the side entry and looked through the gap. The man outside was in his early 60s, broad through the shoulders, wearing a brown wool cap and a canvas coat patched at one elbow with darker cloth. His beard was short and mostly white. In one hand he held a paper bag from the hardware store. In the other, a dented red thermos. "You Jonah Reed, since 1966. Did Mr. Whitaker send you to check on me?" "I told me Margaret's heir had been found. I told him heirs get cold, same as anyone else." Avery opened the door wider but kept her boot behind it. Jonah noticed and did not step in. "I was with the volunteers here before they moved to the county station," he said. "Mechanic, mostly. Pumps, doors, whatever needed swearing at." The bell rang. His face changed only around the eyes. "When?" "Before dawn." "Once," she nodded. Jonah looked up at the cupola, then along the tower wall. "Power's been dead a long time." "I know. Rope's cut. Looks cut." It was. Margaret had it taken down after a boy tried climbing it during a 4th of July open house. He held out the paper bag. "Bought you a cheap respirator and a pack of contractor bags. Receipts in there. You don't owe me." Avery did not take it immediately. Jonah lowered the bag onto the threshold. Fair enough. The practical gift embarrassed her less than sympathy would have. She picked it up, found the respirator still in its plastic, and stepped aside. He entered with the caution of someone greeting an old machine. He did not look around dramatically. He looked at the floor, the roof stains, the tower base, the boarded doors, and the drains. Then he walked to the watchroom window and set his gloved hand on the frame. "Margaret sat in there during storms," he said. "After the department moved out too for a while. People knew if the light was on, the room was warm. There's no heat now. Not now." Avery followed him to the old alarm board. Jonah wiped dust from one porcelain label with his thumb. This place was never just trucks. Bad weather came in from the water roads, iced up phones went out. Folks got stranded. Fishermen's kids, mill workers, women who didn't want questions. Margaret kept coffee on if she had fuel. Avery looked at the cold desk. "Why would she leave it to me?" Jonah's hand paused on the label. "That's Margaret's story to tell if she left it. You knew her. Everybody knew some part of her. Nobody knew all." It was not an answer, but it did not feel like evasion. It felt like a closed drawer he would not force open for someone else. They walked the perimeter together. Jonah showed her where the concrete had settled but not split through, where the brick needed repointing before freeze. Thaw opened it wider where the engine doors could be braced from inside with new lumber. He tapped the cast iron drains with the toe of his boot and listened. One gave a dull, clogged sound. One rang clear. "Water's your first enemy," he said. "Then people. Then pride. Don't climb anything to prove you're brave." I wasn't planning to. But brave gets expensive. In the rear lean-to, rain had begun to fall through a hole where the roof had folded. Jonah pulled aside a wetboard and uncovered an old coal scuttle, rusted but intact. Avery photographed it, then the broken rafters, then the ivy roots entering through mortar. When they returned to the tower base, the faint metal click came again above them. Jonah stopped. Avery raised the flashlight. The beam reached only the first landing and the underside of the hanging brackets. Wind. Could be. He was listening with his whole face now. Broken louver up top can make things talk. The bell talked pretty clearly. That's why we don't guess from the floor. He pointed to the chain across the tower stairs. We come back with daylight masks rope and someone outside who knows we're in here. We, if you'll allow it. Avery wanted to say she did not need anyone. The words were ready from long use. But rain tapped harder on the old roof, and somewhere in the tower, a small piece of metal shifted again, patient as a hand on a closed door. I'll allow daylight, she said. Jonah almost smiled. That's a start. Before he left, he helped her clear one dry corner of the watchroom. They moved fallen plaster into a contractor bag, set a bucket under the worst ceiling drip, and pulled the desk 6 inches away from the damp wall. Jonah gave her the red thermos still full of coffee, and wrote his number on the back of a hardware receipt. Lock the side door from inside, he said. Keep your car keys in your pocket. If the roof starts making new noises, you leave. Building's not worth getting buried under. Avery looked through the interior window at the engine bay. The place seemed larger in the rain, as if water had woken every surface. Margaret thought it was worth something. And you. Jonah adjusted his cap. I think places can hold a promise longer than people expect. But brick still falls if you ignore it. After he left, Avery slid the bolt on the side door and stood in the watchroom with the thermos warming both hands. The coffee was strong and bitter. She drank it slowly, sitting in the cracked chair where Margaret Bellamy might once have answered calls from people who had run out of road in a storm. Outside rain washed the boarded engine doors. Inside the bucket beside the old alarm desk received each leak with a hollow tick. Avery unrolled her sleeping bag on the cleanest strip of floor, placed her boots within reach, and lay down beneath the dead alarm board while the hose tower creaked softly above her. The bell struck again before sunrise with Avery's boots already on. She had fallen asleep in pieces, waking each time the bucket filled another inch, or the tower boards answered the wind. When the iron note rolled down through the building, she was halfway out of the sleeping bag before she understood what had woken her. The sound traveled through the engine bay, through the watchroom glass, through the floor beneath her palms. It was not loud like a church bell on Sunday. It was single hard and old, a voice made for distance. Avery grabbed her phone and ran into the bay with the blanket still caught around one ankle. The room was dark except for the blue wash of the screen. She held the phone up, thumb shaking, and recorded the last tremor as it faded into the rafters. No second strike came. She stood beneath the severed rope and listened until the rain, the drains, and her own breathing separated themselves again. The cut end hung high above unmoving. The plywood across the engine doors showed no fresh gap. The side door bolt was still thrown. Nobody had come in unless they had passed through brick. Avery went first to the electrical panel because fear needed a task. The panel sat in the rear passage under a rusted cover. She lifted it with 2 fingers. Every breaker was down. A paper tag from the utility company, yellowed and stiff, still hung through the main shutoff. Outside, she checked the meter box with her flashlight. No numbers moved behind the cloudy glass. No little wheel turned. The service line sagged from the weatherhead like a dead vine. She recorded that too. By 6:30, she had sent Jonah Reed a message that said only, it rang again. I have video. She expected no answer until later, but her phone buzzed before she reached the watchroom. Don't climb. I'm coming. He arrived in 20 minutes with a coil of rope. 2 hard hats, a toolbox, and a paper sack holding egg sandwiches wrapped in foil. He set the food on the alarm desk without ceremony and watched Avery play the recording. The phone speaker made the bell smaller, thinner, but the shape of the note was there. Jonah listened twice. On the second time, he closed his eyes. That's the station bell, he said. You thought it might not be. I hoped it was something easier. They ate standing up because the chair had begun to wobble. Jonah made Avery put on the respirator before they disturbed anything near the tower. He tied a rope to the base of the stair rail, tested each tread with his boot, and refused to let her follow above the first landing. The old wooden stairs rose steeply inside the square shaft, passing brackets where canvas hoses had once hung in long, damp loops after a fire. A smell of cold brick and bird nests came down around them. Old cotton jacket hoses had to dry straight, Jonah said, touching one bracket with the back of his glove. Roll them wet and they rot from the inside. That's why these towers are tall. Air up, water down. Avery angled her flashlight along the wall. So the tower was built to move air. Exactly. Above them, the broken louver clicked in the wind. Jonah climbed 3 more steps and stopped. There it is. What? Not the bell, the draft. Avery felt it a moment later. A narrow pull of air slid past her face, colder than the rest of the building, steady as breath through a cracked window. It moved downward, then shifted when the wind outside pressed the tower. Somewhere above a small metal part scraped and released. Jonah came down slowly. Dust had settled on the shoulders of his canvas coat. The cupola's not safe enough today. We'll inspect from below first. He opened the toolbox and took out a flashlight brighter than Avery's, a screwdriver, and a small inspection mirror on a telescoping handle. Together, they worked around the base of the tower. The hose rack there was built into the brick oak rails fixed between upright posts blackened by age. Below it, a low beadboard panel ran along the wall. It looked ordinary until Jonah's light passed across a clean crescent in the dust near the right post. Avery crouched. Something rubbed there. Recently, since the dust settled, I don't know how recent. She touched the floor beside it. Grit came away on her glove except for one narrow line, as if a piece of wood had shifted and swept itself clean. Jonah used the mirror to look behind the lower rail. The glass caught darkness, then brick, then the dull curve of metal. Huh, he said. Avery had learned to dislike that sound from mechanics and doctors. What does huh mean? It means Margaret hid better things than Christmas presents. He did not pry. He made her photograph the panel first, then the rack, then the dust line. After that, he worked the screwdriver gently along the seam. The beadboard did not move. He changed angles, pressed near the post, and something clicked from inside the wall. Both of them froze. The bell did not ring, but far above a faint answering tremor passed through the rope chase. Jonah withdrew his hand. Spring latch. On a wall panel. Could be for service. Could be Margaret. Avery found herself holding her breath. Service for what? Bell mechanism, maybe. Old stations got altered a dozen times. People used whatever chase was already there. He asked for her flashlight, then pointed to the oak post where years of grime covered the grain. See that brass spot? Avery leaned closer. At first it looked like a nail head. Then she saw the edge of a small round weight set into the wood, tarnished almost black. A shallow groove crossed it, not decorative, more like the slot in a screw. Jonah took a coin from his pocket and fitted it into the groove. May I? It's your station more than mine. No, he said, still looking at the brass. It isn't. The coin turned a 1/4 inch. A panel at the bottom of the hose rack loosened with a soft wooden sigh. It did not swing open. It shifted forward enough for dust to fall in a gray veil. Avery sat back on her heels. The air coming from the gap was dry and cold. Not moldy, not the sour smell of rot. Jonah slid 2 fingers into the opening and stopped. Don't reach blind, Avery said. He looked at her, one eyebrow raised. You said that yesterday about buildings. Seems like it applies to holes. This time he did smile. Fair. I used pliers to draw the panel forward. Behind it was a narrow pocket no wider than a shoebox and twice as deep built between the tower post and the brick chase. A strip of oiled cloth had been tacked along the top to shed damp. Inside, at the very front, lay a soot-stained brass tag on a short length of broken chain. Avery lifted it out with both hands. The tag was oval-heavy and cold enough to ache through her glove. Letters had been stamped by hand across its face, uneven but clear. Bellamy watch, keep the room warm. She read it once silently, then aloud. Jonah removed his cap. He did not seem to notice doing it. You've seen this before, Avery asked. No, but I've heard the phrase. From Margaret. From men who thought they invented kindness because they remembered half of what women did. Avery turned the tag over. The back held 3 initials scratched small near the bottom, MBECAC. Her throat tightened before her mind accepted the middle pair. E.C. Elise Callahan. My mother, she said. Jonah's gaze moved to the initials. He stayed quiet long enough for the tower to creak above them. She was here, Avery asked. I don't know the whole of it, but you know some. I know Margaret opened this room during the ice storm in '98. I know a young woman came in with a baby. I was on a road washout that night. By the time I got back, Margaret had put them near the coal stove and told everyone to mind their own work. Avery closed her fingers around the tag. I was the baby. I wondered. The building seemed to tilt inward around her. Not dangerously. Carefully. The watchroom, the dead alarm board, the cold desk with its pencil grooves, the phrase stamped on brass. Keep the room warm. It had sounded like instruction. Now, it sounded like a record. Avery stood too quickly and bumped the hose rack. Something inside the pocket shifted. Jonah steadied the rack with one hand. Easy. There's more in there. Yes. And we take it out. We can look. If it's paper, we slow down. Hushing the light deeper into the pocket. Behind where the tag had rested, an oilcloth-wrapped packet sat on two narrow wooden cleats. It was long flat and tied with cotton tape. Beside it, set into the side wall, was a metal rod leading upward into the chase. Jonah followed the rod with the inspection mirror. That's our bell ghost. Avery's attention split between the packet and the rod. How old striker, weight linkage. See the rod. Something shifts at the louver, pulls just enough, clapper kisses the bell. If the spring's partly reset and the wind hits right, it'll strike once. Maybe twice if the catch slips. So it's broken. Broken, altered, and waiting for weather. He touched the brass weight set into the post. This likely released the service panel. The same chase carries the old rope path. Margaret may have known the wind would call attention if the latch worked loose. That sounds too deliberate. Margaret was deliberate. Avery looked up into the shaft. The dawn wind moved through the tower, clicking one loose piece against another. The mystery did not vanish when it became mechanical. If anything, it became stranger. Someone had built a system of rope, weight, spring, and bell, so a whole town could be summoned. Then someone had hidden a private message beside it, trusting wood, metal, and weather to outlast speech. Jonah did not remove the packet until they had cleared the watchroom desk, wiped it dry, and laid down a clean piece of cardboard from his truck. He carried the oilcloth in both hands as if it were more fragile than it looked. Avery followed with the brass tag. The first sunlight entered through the broken tower slats before it reached the front windows. It came thin and gold, striping the dust in the engine bay, catching on the raised letters in Avery's palm. Bellamy watch, keep the room warm. She stood under that light, holding the soot-stained tag, while above her the bell remained silent at last. Jonah carried the oilcloth packet to the watchroom desk and did not untie it until Avery had moved the bucket farther from the drip. The room had become a place of small precautions, cardboard under the packet, clean gloves from Jonah's truck, her phone propped on a coffee can to photograph each step. Outside morning traffic passed on Bell Street tires, whispering over wet pavement. But inside the station, every sound seemed to belong to the packet. The cotton tape had browned with age. Jonah loosened the knot with a screwdriver tip instead of pulling. The oilcloth opened in stiff folds, releasing the smell of cold wax paper and old smoke. Inside lay a narrow ledger with a black cloth cover, 3 envelopes, and a flat tin map key no longer than Avery's thumb. The ledger came first. Its pages were ruled in blue, the lines faded but steady. Margaret Bellamy's handwriting filled them in tight columns: date, weather, name. If given place, found blanket number, food transport follow-up. Some entries were ordinary enough to hurt. Mr. Nolan North Wharf, hand-cut wife called. Boy from Mill Road, asthma, brought inside until father arrived. Unknown woman, no questions, coffee and dry coat. Avery turned one page with the back of her gloved finger. The years moved backward. Storms, road washouts, frozen pipes, fires that had taken porches but spared kitchens, boats overdue and then found. Margaret had not written like someone seeking praise. The notes were plain, almost severe. A person came in cold. A blanket went out. A ride was arranged. A name was protected when protection mattered. Jonah stood beside the desk with his cap in both hands. She kept the official dispatch book separate, he said. This wasn't for the department. What was it for? To remember who still needed checking on after the trucks went back. Avery looked at the alarm board through the interior window. The dead bulbs waited under their porcelain labels. She had thought a fire station was a place for sirens and hoses for men in heavy coats running toward visible danger. Margaret's ledger showed another kind of work. Soup poured after midnight, a cot found in a corner, a child's boots dried near a coal stove. A woman sent home by a back road because the front one held someone she feared. Near the middle of the ledger, Jonah's finger stopped above a date. January 8, 1998. Ice storm. Lines down from Harbor Road to School Hill. Young woman, Elise C. infant girl. No family contact listed. Warmed in watch room blanket, for milk from Gray store, ride delayed until road sanded. Returned blue mug. Avery sat down slowly. The chair gave a small wooden complaint beneath her. She read the line again until the letters blurred and returned. Elise C. infant girl. Blue mug. Her mother's mug was in the hatchback behind the station wrapped in a diner towel, the glaze chipped near the handle. She never told me, Avery said. Jonah's voice was low. Maybe she wanted that night to be over. Avery touched the page beside the entry, not on the ink. Her mother had told plenty of hard stories, but always with pieces removed. A landlord who changed locks, a winter when they moved twice, a woman at a station who made coffee strong enough to wake the dead. Avery had thought that last detail belonged to one of Elise's scattered jokes, the kind she used to soften hunger or bad luck. The first envelope held Margaret's letter. It was addressed to Avery Mae Callahan in the same slanted hand as the key tag. Jonah looked away while Avery opened it. Avery, if this reaches you, then I have trusted paper longer than conversation. That may be unfair to you. It is the only way I know to leave the choice in your hands. You were brought into this engine house once before you were old enough to remember. Your mother was cold, frightened, and trying not to ask for more than she could repay. She did not owe me repayment. No one who came through this watchroom door did. The engine house was built to answer bells. But over the years, I learned that not every emergency makes enough noise for a town to hear. Some people arrive quietly. Some leave before dawn. Some need warmth and privacy more than rescue lights. A bell does not ask who deserves to be heard. Avery stopped there. The sentence seemed to move through the room differently from the other words. It crossed the desk. The dead alarm board, the old drains, the boarded doors. It made no demand of her, and because of that, it was harder to ignore. She read on. I have left you this building because I could not keep it standing by myself, and because your mother once told me you noticed broken things before anyone else did. Do not let anyone tell you the place is valuable only if it can be sold. Do not let anyone tell you kindness becomes foolish because it was done quietly. In the map drawer upstairs is the proof of the old public use promise. In this packet is enough to begin asking the right questions. If the town takes the building down, let it be because every honest effort failed, not because no one remembered what happened here. Margaret Bellamy. The letter did not say love. It did not claim family. It did not make Avery into some secret granddaughter or stolen heir. Somehow, that made it feel more serious. Margaret had left her a dangerous building a record and a choice not because blood required it, but because one winter night her mother had been allowed to sit near a stove without explaining herself. The second envelope contained photocopies of old town minutes brittle at the folds. Ruth Pike, the librarian, arrived just as Jonah was spreading them on the cardboard. She was small, silver-haired, and wore rain boots under a wool skirt. Jonah had called her without asking Avery, then apologized for it before Ruth even removed her coat. Paper makes me nervous in wet buildings, Ruth said, setting a flat archival box on the desk. People make me nervous when they handle paper in wet buildings. Avery found herself stepping back as if caught doing something wrong. Ruth's expression softened. That means I'm useful, not angry. She showed Avery how to slide each page onto clean backing, how to photograph without flattening the spine, how to let damp paper acclimate before sealing it away. The practical care steadied the room. It turned discovery into procedure. The town minutes described Pine Harbor Engine House as a fire facility and winter relief room. One paragraph, dated 1936, referred to continued public warming use during coastal storms when roads, wires, and ordinary channels fail. Another page named the Bellamy Watch not as an official department but as a volunteer roster for nights when the station stayed open after calls ended. Ruth tapped the photocopy with a pencil. This matters. It doesn't solve your condemnation problem by itself, but it proves the building had a civic use beyond equipment storage. Avery looked toward the engine bay. Does the town know? The town forgets anything not repeated at meetings, Ruth said. Jonah made a sound that might have been agreement. The third envelope remained sealed until Ruth gave permission. Inside was a short deed note, not the full instrument, but enough to name a restriction tied to continued local benefit. The language was old and narrow. Avery understood only pieces, maintenance, refuge, public use, no private conversion without review. It was not treasure, it was obligation written in legal bones. There may be more upstairs, Ruth said. Margaret's letter mentions a map drawer. The office floor is soft near the filing cabinet, Avery said. Then nobody goes digging today, Jonah said. For once, Avery did not argue. Ruth and Jonah stepped into the bay to discuss roof tarps. The ink on her mother's name looked smaller, now more human. Not proof of abandonment. Not proof of rescue in the grand way people like to tell stories. Just a line that said on one terrible night Elise Callahan and her infant daughter had been cold, and someone had made the room warm. Avery laid the brass tag beside the page. For several minutes she did nothing else. Rainwater ticked into the bucket. Wind moved through the tower without ringing the bell. The building around her remained damaged, unpaid for, and under threat. But the desk no longer felt empty. She slid her mother's ledger entry under the clean sheet of glass, smoothing the edges with 2 careful fingers. Avery began with the roof because Jonah would not let her begin anywhere else. The next morning he brought a folding ladder, 3 tarps, 2 bundles of furring strips, and Daniel Arsenault, a mason with square hands and a habit of looking at walls before looking at people. Daniel walked the outside perimeter with a pencil behind his ear, tapping brick with the handle of a pointing trowel. He did not touch the tower until he had studied the mortar at its base for several minutes. Corners moving, but not today, he said. Avery was not sure whether that was good news. It means we don't pretend it's fine, Daniel added, and we don't panic so hard we make it worse. They marked the worst leaks first over the watchroom above the rear passage beside the hose tower where flashing had pulled away from brick. Jonah climbed only as far as the low roof and tied himself off before handing Avery the safer work below. She dragged wet boards from the lean-to filled contractor bags with plaster and learned that old buildings punished haste in small, exact ways. A nail through a boot sole, a shard of slate under the palm, a rotten board that looked solid until her weight taught it otherwise. By afternoon, the worst. Opening over the watchroom wore a tarp held down by furring strips and sandbags. It was ugly blue and temporary. It was also the first thing Avery had done to the engine house that made tomorrow less dangerous than yesterday. Inside, she cleared a path from the side door to the watchroom, then from the watchroom to the engine bay drains. She did not throw everything away. Ruth had left 3 labeled boxes, keep, photograph, discard. A cracked lantern went into photograph. A bird-ruined cardboard carton went into discard. A small, brass nozzle green at the threads went into keep after Jonah wiped it with his glove and went quiet. That one rode on the old hand line, he said. Avery set it down more gently after that. That night, rain returned, but only 1 bucket filled. She lay in the sleeping bag beneath the dead alarm board and listened to the reduced dripping as if it were a repair speaking back. Jonah would not work on the bell until the tower floor was swept. The first landing braced, and then Avery promised twice not to climb beyond the marked step. He brought a portable work light powered by a battery pack, though its beam made the tower look less haunted and more neglected. Bird feathers, cracked louver slats, old pulley, hardware dust lying thick on the brackets where hoses had dried in another century of weather. The bell is not an alarm anymore, he said. We treat it as history and as heavy metal over our heads. Avery held the light while he opened the service panel behind the hose rack again. The spring latch, once hidden, looked simple in daylight. A brass cam, a narrow rod, a corroded return spring, and the round weight set into the oak post. The rod disappeared upward through the old rope chase. Jonah had her photograph each piece before he touched it. When the wind comes through that broken louver, he said, it can shove loose hardware just enough to tug this rod. If the clapper's resting close, the bell strikes once. So Margaret didn't set a trap. No, she left a pocket. The building supplied the rest. That answer relieved Avery and disappointed her at the same time. A miracle would have asked nothing practical from her. A mechanism asked for screws, judgment, restraint. Jonah loosened the linkage from below and wired the striker weight in a neutral position until the cupola could be inspected safely. He did not remove the system. Old parts tell the truth if you don't rush to replace them, he said. Avery cleaned the brass tag with a dry cloth only where Ruth had approved. The stamped words emerged a little clearer, but the soot remained in the low places. She liked it better that way. Clean enough to read, scarred enough to be honest. Near noon, Jonah let her pull the loose lower panel into place and turn the brass weight back to its locked position. The click was small, exact, satisfying. For the first time, Avery understood how someone could spend a life keeping a building's minor promises. The latch that caught the drain, that cleared the bell, that stayed silent until it was truly needed. Ruth Pike arrived with archival folders, a scanner no larger than a lunch tray, and a thermos of lemon tea she claimed not to have brought for anyone in particular. She set up on the watchroom desk after Avery wiped it twice and taped plastic over the ceiling stain. No original ledger pages near open drinks, Ruth said. Jonah lifted his coffee and stepped backward without a word. They worked for 4 hours. Avery read each page number aloud while Ruth photographed, scanned, and slid the sheets into protective sleeves. Some names were familiar from street signs. Some were only initials. Some entries withheld names entirely, and Ruth told Avery those omissions mattered as much as ink. "Do we make it public?" Avery asked. "Not all of it." Ruth adjusted the scanner lid. "History is not the same as exposure." So they built 2 records. One private preservation file with the full ledger sealed for proper review, one public history folder with dates, weather events, the Bellamy watch roster, and examples that did not turn anyone's worst night into display. Avery copied Margaret's sentence onto a clean index card, then stopped with the pen hovering. A bell does not ask who deserves to be heard. The words belonged in the room, but not yet on a wall. Not while she still understood only the edge of them. Ruth noticed and did not comment. Instead, she handed Avery a folder from the town archive. Inside was a photograph of the engine house in Winter Bay doors, open snow piled against the curb. A woman in a dark coat stood at the watchroom doorway with one hand on a kettle. The caption on the back read, M. Bellamy, Storm Room, February 1978. Avery studied the woman's face. Margaret was younger than Avery had imagined, not soft, not stern, her gaze directed slightly past the camera toward someone outside the frame. "She looks busy," Avery said. She usually was. The public folder grew slowly, old photographs, town minute excerpts, a copy of the 1936 warming room language, a note. Explaining hose towers, a map of storm routes with private addresses covered. It was not enough to save the building. But it was enough to prove the station had once done more than store equipment. When Ruth packed up, she left Avery with 3 acid-free envelopes and a warning. Curiosity can damage paper as quickly as damp. Wait on the upstairs drawer until the floor is safe. Avery looked toward the office ceiling where water had stained the plaster brown. Waiting had never felt like work before. Now it did. Daniel returned 2 days later with lime mortar, a spray bottle, a margin trowel, and a radio he never turned on. He showed Avery the difference between old mortar and the hard, modern patch someone had smeared into the tower base years earlier. "Brick needs to breathe," he said, scraping at the bad patch. "Trap water in old brick and winter will do the demolition for you." Avery mixed mortar under his direction in a shallow pan, adding water by the capful after she made it too loose the first time. Daniel did not flatter her. He made her do it again. Then he showed her how to mist the joint press mortar into layers and strike it back so rain would shed instead of sit. Her wrists ached by the 3rd course. Cold settled under her gloves. Grit worked into the split at her thumb until it stung. But the open joint beneath the tower began to close, not hidden, not disguised, simply made whole enough to face weather. Daniel charged less than the estimate he had written. "That isn't the number you gave me," Avery said. "That was the number for a customer who watches. I worked. You listened. Difference matters." He nodded toward the engine bay. "Pay the rest when the town stops threatening to flatten it." She wanted to refuse the kindness because accepting it made her visible. Instead, she wrote the amount in a notebook, dated it, and labeled it Ode to Daniel Arsenault of Masonry Labor. If she could not pay today, she could at least refuse to let help become fog. By the end of the week, the engine house looked worse from the street in the way repaired things often did before they looked better. Tarps crossed the roof. Caution tape marked the tower corner. Contractor bags lined the rear wall, the sham. Inside, the engine bay floor was clear enough to see the drain slope. Jonah had braced one warped engine door from the inside. Ruth's public folder sat in a plastic bin on the watchroom desk. The brass tag rested beside Avery's mother's ledger entry under glass. On Friday afternoon, Avery gripped the iron handle of the left engine door while Jonah lifted the brace. The door dragged, caught, then gave with a long scrape over concrete. Damp daylight entered across the floor, revealing dust footprints, repaired mortar, and the dark circles where fire trucks had once stood. Avery pulled again. This time, the door opened wide enough for the street to see in. The town review took place in a room that smelled of damp coats and copier toner. Avery sat behind a folding table with Ruth's public history folder, Daniel's stabilization estimate, Jonah's photographs, and a list of repairs written in her own square hand. She had worn the navy jacket because it was the only one she owned, but she had washed the sleeves in the library restroom the night before. The code officer spoke first. Roof intrusion, unsecured rear lean-to, loose tower masonry, open risk to sidewalk and street. His words were not cruel. That made them harder to fight. When Avery's turn came, she did not tell them the bell had called her. She showed them the tarps, the braced engine door, the cleared drains, the mortar work at the tower base, and the archival copy of the 1936 warming room language. Ruth explained the Bellamy watch in 2 dry paragraphs. Jonah described the bell linkage as secured. Daniel said the tower needed money but not a wrecking ball. A selectman with tired eyes asked, "And what exactly do you intend this building to be?" Avery placed Margaret's public use note beside her mother's ledger entry with private lines covered. Her hand shook only once. "A warm room first," she said. "Not a museum first, not a business first, a place that can be opened during storms while the rest is repaired properly." The board did not save the engine house that night. It gave her 90 days inspection, required no public occupancy until basic safety work passed. Avery walked back through cold mist with the papers under her jacket and a decision she had not owned before. Delay was not mercy, but it was time. Help arrived in objects before it arrived in people. A dented helmet appeared at the side door in a grocery bag with a note. "My father wore this before radios worked right." A wool blanket came from Helen Grace, who remembered Margaret heating milk on a coal stove. Tessa Moore at the hardware store opened a store credit line so carefully itemized that Avery could accept it without feeling erased. Someone left a hand-drawn harbor map sealed in plastic. Someone else brought a brass nozzle and 2 old photographs, then left before Avery could ask his name. Each object made the engine bay less empty and more accountable. Ruth helped her tag everything with pencil numbers. Jonah built a temporary display shelf from salvaged boards high enough to avoid damp and plain enough not to pretend the station was restored. Avery kept private names out of sight. She learned to say, "That part of the ledger stays protected," without apologizing. One evening, Helen Grace stood at the threshold holding a paper sack of clean dish towels. Her hair was white, her coat too thin for the wind. "Margaret never made a show of it," Helen said, looking toward the watchroom. "That was the point." Avery took the towels. "I'm trying not to." "You're doing all right then." It was the smallest approval, and it stayed with her longer than praise would have. By January, the watchroom could hold heat for 4 hours from a safe electric heater run on a permitted temporary line. The roof still wore tarps, but the worst leaks had stopped. Daniel's mortar had cured through damp weeks under burlap. Jonah had repaired the engine door track enough that Avery could open the left bay without bracing her foot against the wall. The first posted hours were not official shelter hours. The town would not allow that yet. Ruth called them supervised preservation work sessions, which fooled no one and satisfied enough paperwork to let 3 volunteers sweep, label, and sort. Avery set a kettle on a metal cart, a stack of clean blankets on the watchroom chair, and a sign-in book on the desk. She did not ask anyone why they came. Some wanted to remember. Some wanted to be useful. One man stood under the bell cupola for 10 minutes and said only, "My brother's name is in that private book, isn't it?" Avery answered the way Ruth had taught her. "The ledger is protected, but people were cared for here." He nodded, wiped his eyes with the heel of his hand, and spent the next hour tightening screws in the display shelf. That night, Avery slept upstairs for the first time in the small office after Jonah and Daniel laid plywood over the weak section and marked the unsafe corner in red tape. Her mattress was foam on the floor. Her mother's blue mug sat on the windowsill. Wind moved through the tower, but the bell stayed quiet. The test came in March when wet snow turned to rain, and the harbor wind drove water sideways into Bell Street. Avery woke to the sound of gutters choking and ran downstairs with her boots unlaced. The rear drain had packed with slush. Water pushed across the concrete apron toward the side door. She worked by headlamp breaking ice with a shovel while Jonah cleared the street-side drain and Daniel checked the tower base with a flashlight held under his chin. Ruth arrived with towels and archival boxes, scolding all of them for dripping near paper while she moved the public folder to higher shelves. For 2 hours, the building answered every repair honestly. The tarps strained but held. The repointed tower corner shed water instead of drinking it. The engine door rattled, then stayed on its track. In the watchroom, the bucket under the old stain remained almost dry. Near dawn, the wind struck the broken louver hard enough to make the tower groan. Avery looked up, waiting for the bell. Nothing rang. Jonah followed her gaze. "That's good work," he said. Avery stood in the open bay with snowmelt running around her boots and felt the difference between silence and absence. The bell was not dead. It simply no longer had to cry out through neglect. By early June, the engine house smelled less like damp plaster and more like lime mortar, floor soap, old wood, and coffee. The ivy on the north wall had died back enough to remove without tearing brick. New gutters, plain and dark, carried rain away from the tower. The left engine door opened smoothly. The right still needed persuasion, but it moved. The bell had been lowered only far enough for inspection, never polished into false youth. Jonah cleaned the striker assembly with oil rags and patience. He left small pits in the brass and a dark bruise along the rim where years of weather had marked it. When he reinstalled the clapper, he let Avery tighten the final nut under his direction. "History doesn't need to shine," he said. "It needs to hold." The upstairs office became Avery's caretaker room, one repair at a time. A second-hand bed, a hot plate approved for temporary use, a shelf for the blue mug, a clean curtain Ruth found at a church sale. It was not much larger than the room above Marlene's diner had been, but the floor no longer felt borrowed from someone else's patience. The locked map drawer waited until Daniel reinforced the office corner. When Avery finally opened it, with the flat tin key from Margaret's packet, she found old response maps, bridge, weight notes, hand-marked storm routes, and a receipt book in Margaret's writing. The last pages showed small payments made year after year. Roof patch, coal delivery, blanket wash, window repair, insurance inquiry. Margaret had spent what she could to keep the building almost ready, long after the town had stopped expecting anything from it. At the back of the drawer lay a bank letter describing a modest maintenance account restricted to the engine house. Not enough to transform it. Enough to keep the roof, honest buy, insurance-preserved documents, and repair heat in the watchroom if Avery used it as promised. She sat with that paper for a long time. The old Avery, the one who counted coins in a freezing car, would have known every personal use for that money before the page left the envelope. The new Avery still knew them. Debt did not vanish because a person found purpose. Hunger did not become noble because a building had a story. But the account had Margaret's boundaries around it, and those boundaries felt like trust. Paul Whitaker helped draft the agreement. Ruth reviewed the public history language. The town approved a limited seasonal warming room use under a local nonprofit partnership with Avery named as caretaker and site coordinator. No speeches were made. No newspaper headline arrived. The approval came by email on a Tuesday between an insurance form and a reminder about fire extinguishers. Avery printed it at the library and carried it back to the station under her jacket, smiling only after she had locked the side door behind her. On the first open morning, Jonah arrived early in a clean shirt and the same patched coat. Daniel checked the tower base, though everyone knew he had already checked it twice. Ruth placed the public folder on the watchroom desk open to the photograph of Margaret in the storm-room doorway. Helen Grace brought folded towels. Tessa Moore brought a box of mugs from the hardware store clearance shelf. Avery set the sign-in book beside the kettle. Its pages had columns for date volunteer task supplies used and follow-up needed. No column asked why someone had come in cold. Before she unlocked the engine doors, she stood beneath the bell and looked up through the repaired cupola framing. June light rested on the brass without glare. The rope remained absent. The striker was secured. If the bell ever rang again, it would be because someone chose to ring it for a real need. Avery touched the brass tag hanging now inside the watchroom low enough to read, but not to handle. Bellamy Watch, keep the room warm. A bell does not ask who deserves to be heard, she said. Then Jonah lifted the brace, Daniel took the right door, and Avery pulled the left. The engine house opened to Bell Street with a long wooden breath. Sunlight crossed the concrete, reached the old drain circles, and touched the watchroom chair where the first clean blanket waited. That it did not have to call Avery home again.